In this episode, you're going to learn the 8 most important factors when it comes to getting new listeners to check out your show. Let's dive in. In a world where ad costs are continually rising and prospects are getting more and more skeptical about who they can trust, how can you reach new people in a way that's authentic and effective? A place where you can build trust at scale and convert skeptical prospects into raving fans and clients. Hey, my name is Luis Diaz, and you're listening to the Podcast Domination Show, the place for entrepreneurs and businesses that want to know how to build a podcast that helps them grow their business, get more clients, and build their brand. I appreciate your time. Thanks for joining me. What's going on? Welcome back to the Podcast Domination Show, or welcome for the first time to the Podcast Domination Show. I am solely focused on making this the number one podcast for you if you want to launch and grow podcasts. If you're a business owner who knows you want a podcast, knows it can help your business, but can't find the time or don't know where to start, this is the podcast for you. So welcome. Today, you're going to learn how people discover new podcasts. And there's not a lot of research on this, but I've a friend of mine, a distant friend of mine in the industry, Colin from the podcasthost.com. He's got a ton of resources. I highly suggest you check out the podcasthost.com for all needs, everything podcasting. But a couple months ago, his team and I put out a really good survey and some really good stats on how people actually discover new podcasts to listen to. And one of the graphs he actually had in that article, which will be linked in the show notes for this episode. So if you're on Apple Podcasts, just swipe up and you should see the show notes there. But I'm going to read through some of the stats and kind of talk about a little bit of them each. Now, this article went through a lot of different things, but what I want to focus on here is the specific graph about, what people consider factors they're weighing when it comes to looking at whether or not they should listen to a new podcast. So I found this part of it really interesting because we always talk about so many different elements: the artwork, the intro, the outro. We talk about the music. We talk about the description, the title. We talk about, the topic, the title of the actual episode. There's a lot of factors we talk about when it comes to, hey, whether or not people are going to pick your podcast to listen to it, whether or not they're going to give it a chance, right? I'm going to lay out what this study actually found. And if you want details, I don't have it. I have part of it pulled up in front of me. I don't want to waste too much time here getting into it. Actually, no, I have it here, so never mind. We'll go into this a little bit. So 780 people took the survey. 41% of them have never run a podcast. This was done on March 2020. This was published. So 41% have never run a podcast out of 780. So the majority of them were podcasters. However, this is still I think for me personally, it's a very good idea, a good place to start when it comes to figuring out, okay, what should I focus on? What's important? What's not? So we'll go through these together and we'll talk about each of these factors that people are considering when they're looking at whether or not they should listen to your podcast. So number one is, and this is what we'll do is we will go from least important to most important. So you have to stay to the end to hear the most important. Yes, I am going to do that today. Keep build up some of the excitement. So the least important factor, according to this study from the podcasthost.com, is whether or not they have heard of the presenter. So presenter, I'm pretty sure they mean host. Yeah, here we go. Yeah, they mean host. So they mean the host. So whether or not they have heard of the host is out of 10, 3.7. So 3.7, I guess, 3.7 out of 10 would be kind of where they look at that in terms of how important that is. So it's very low compared to some of the other ones, obviously. So the good thing about that is that you can be a nobody. You can be like I was when I started out 24 years old. I was a nobody and literally just started talking about things people were interested in. And I got listeners. I started to get clients. I started to actually monetize my podcast rather quickly. And this speaks to that truth because I wasn't a well-known name back then. I still am not a well-known name. So according to this study, whether or not they've heard of you as a host does not matter as much as some of these other things that we're going to talk about here. The next one up is similar. And the next one, which is that last one was 3.7 in terms of out of 10. The next one is 4.6, and that is whether or not they have heard of the interview guest. So the name of your guest, whether, that's not a hugely important factor according to this survey. Now, I will tell you from experience, we've had guests, we've had clients where they have like NFL Pro Bowl winners or, Super Bowl champs on their podcast. And in that scenario, yeah, it makes a big difference. So take this case by case. But overall, the study is telling us that it's not terribly important. It's 4.6 out of 10 when it comes to importance of whether or not someone's going to choose to listen to your podcast or not. So not that big of a deal. That's number 2. The next one actually really surprised me. I thought this was going to be much more important to people, but I think it's case by case. Some people may think this is more important than others. I certainly think it's an important factor, and that is the name of the podcast came in at 5.1 out of 10 when it comes to the most important factors of choosing to listen to or considering a new podcast. So the name of the podcast, that is your actual name of the show, is the Podcast Domination Show. And for some people, apparently it's not that important. There's still 5 other things that are ahead of that when it comes to importance. So that was 5.1. So far we've got the name of the presenter, aka the host, at the least important. The name of the guest, or whether or not they've known or heard of the guests, as the second from the last. And then next one we've just covered is the name of the podcast. So whether or not they know you or the guest or the name of the show apparently is not that big of a deal compared to some other things. Now, the fourth one we're going to talk about here is the podcast artwork. And this is a big thing. Artwork is what catches your eye. For me, it's what's going to get people actually vaguely interested in your show. So for me, this has always been an important factor when we're working with new clients who want to start their podcast. We go through a couple of phases when it comes to podcast artwork because it's not easy to nail in the first time. And there's a lot of other factors you have to weigh in there. So podcast artwork came in at 5.2 when it comes to considering a new show. Very interesting indeed. You'll be surprised, as I was, maybe you won't be, but I was surprised by the number 1 factor. But a couple more to go before that. So next, and people ask a lot of times whether ratings and reviews are important. And for me, they've always been an important thing because it's social proof. It's not that it builds or gives you higher rankings in Apple Podcasts or any of the directories, at least to my knowledge. But I know people look at them just like they look at Amazon reviews. People it's a herd mentality. People want to go where all the other people are at. Nobody wants to be the first one at the party. So podcast ratings and reviews are important. They came in at 5.3 out of 10. And also they came in front of artwork, the title of the podcast, whether or not they've heard of the guest, whether or not they've heard of you. So 5.3 podcast ratings and reviews. That's why it's important to be collecting those reviews. And I've always shared my feedback on this. I like to do a very intense push for this during specific times of the year. So what I mean by that is instead of asking for ratings and reviews every single episode, personally, what I've always told my clients is like, I'd rather you just say, hey, why don't we take the next month and announce to our audience, we are pushing hard for ratings and reviews and we're happy to incentivize for this as well. Most people are not going to waste time to give you a review if there's nothing in it for them. I like to give my listeners some kind of incentive. We'll give you a free book. We'll give you a shout out on the show. We'll give you a discount code to the store. We want to incentivize this so that we can get 40, 50, 30 reviews in 1 month. And then we can come back and rinse and repeat and do that again later on. For me, a rating review is something I don't want to take up my precious intro and outro space for personally. I'd rather just do a focused, maybe 1 month period of getting reviews. And then we do that a couple months later down the road, because that inventory or that space on my intro and outro should be used for more income producing opportunities. Going to sign up, getting people to go sign up for your application to work with you, getting people to go and opt into a free course, getting people to your Facebook group, getting people on your email list. That's what I want as a person who advises a lot of entrepreneurs to help them grow their podcast. That's what I always advocate for. So for me, ratings and reviews, this is an interesting one. I think it's really important, but I don't think you should be wasting all of your time on it. That's weird. So let me rephrase that. You shouldn't be wasting all of your intro and outro space for it 365. You should probably do this a couple times a year, focus on it, push really hard, give them a gift or incentive to go and do it. and then leave it alone. Moving on. The next one, the frequency of new episodes. Now, maybe this is out by the time this episode goes live, but if not, if it is, we'll make sure it's linked in the show notes. But frequency of new episodes is something I talk about a lot of times, and that's something I've studied when it comes to who are the most successful podcasters. Typically, it's the ones, if you look at the top charts of iTunes or Apple Podcasts, there's no one in there who, their last podcast episode was like 3 weeks ago or a month ago. I can almost guarantee it that everyone on that top 100 charts has published an episode within the last week to 2 weeks max, or else they wouldn't be there. Frequency of new episodes is super important for me too. If I see that you haven't posted anything in a month, I'm like, why should I even wait around? Unless the title of the episode is really good, then I'm probably not going to subscribe to that show. Next, the second biggest factor, I guess I would say, according to this study, when it comes to people choosing whether they want to listen to a new show or not, is the episode titles. Is the second most important factor. For me, this is obvious, but if you haven't been spending a lot of time on your podcast titles, I suggest you do it. You have to also look. One key tip here is you want to think about the SEO perspective of like, hey, what keywords are actually important and what are going to get me to rank, and then also you want to think about what's going to get people to click on my podcast. I'm not saying create clickbaity, super misleading titles, but I'm saying think about your listener, think about what's their biggest problems right now. What podcast episodes can you create that solve those problems? Because those are usually the ones that people are trying to look for. They're trying to solve the problems in their life. So 1, 2, 3, 4. We've gone through 7 of them. And the most important factor when considering a new show, according to the study from thepodcasthost.com, is the podcast description. And this is an interesting one. I did not think that this was going to be the most important factor, but it makes sense. It's the paragraph about you and your show. That's at the top of almost every podcast directory. Also, make note of this, not every directory indexes the description, but some do. For example, Apple Podcasts, they do not index, meaning they do not crawl the description. So it's strictly for human eyes. You can't stuff it with keywords and rank higher. Now, other directories, and I'm blanking on the specific ones. I'm sure you can find this online somewhere, but I had an article not too long ago that I found that, and I can't find it. I spent like 20 minutes before recording this trying to find it, but it described and it told you which podcast descriptions or directories index the description, meaning they crawl it. So if you put any keywords in there, people are going to be able to search for those keywords and your podcast will show up. Ideally, that's the idea at least. So podcast description, most important factor according to this study. I'd love to hear your feedback on what you think is in your market. What's the most important factor? Because I'm curious to see if it's different from this, and I love to study and learn more about this stuff. So you can reach me always at Luis, Luis at podcastdomination.co, and we can chat there. Of course, also after this podcast is over, there's a little short piece that shows you how to get some free stuff from me, free daily emails from me as well, which if you have those, you can also contact me through just hitting reply on them. So without further ado, thank you so much. I hope these were helpful for you. I hope this helps you build a better podcast, because that is the goal of this show, and help you ultimately dominate your niche. I'll catch you later, guys. Make sure you hit me up if you have questions. Luis at podcastdomination.co. Looking forward to chatting. Until then, see you next week. Hey, really quick, if you wanted to get daily emails to help you grow your podcast and your profits from your podcast, then you're going to love my daily email list called the Daily Growth Tip. It's basically a small email I send out every single day to help you do just that, either grow your podcast or grow the profits from your podcasting endeavors. So I've got a lot of great reviews from it so far from people who are on the list, and I'm sure you will find at least one thing in there that you'll be able to use right away. So if you want to check that out, then all you have to do is text the word podcasting to 1-646-495-9867. I know that's a mouthful, guys, so don't do it if you're driving. But again, the number is 1-646-495-9867. And the word to text is podcasting. And that number, as well as the keyword podcasting, will be in the show notes. So if you're on an Apple device, all you have to do is swipe up. with your finger, and the show notes will be there, and you'll be able to get all that information and get on the list that way as well. So thanks again, my friend. Talk soon.